The WNBA didn't just update a contract. It quietly detonated the foundation it has been standing on for decades. When Commissioner Kathy Engelbert stepped in front of reporters and acknowledged the players' decision to opt out of the current collective bargaining agreement, the tone felt different. This wasn't the usual polished corporate language about continued growth or positive discussions. There was weight behind her words. The kind of weight that signals something irreversible has already been set in motion. Because once players officially exercise their right to walk away from a deal, there's no pretending everything is fine anymore. For years, the league operated under a survival mindset. Gradual growth, incremental increases, careful budgeting, controlled expectations. It was a model built for stability, not explosion. But something happened over the past 2 seasons that shattered that pace. Attendance surged. Television ratings spiked. Merchandise flew off digital shelves so fast the online store crashed more than once. Arenas that once struggled to fill lower bowls suddenly needed capacity upgrades. And the players noticed. They noticed the sellouts. They noticed the media frenzy. They noticed the billion-dollar headlines. And most importantly, they noticed that their paychecks didn't reflect any of it. So when the opt-out became official, it wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic. A calculated signal that the old math no longer works in a league that has outgrown its old valuation. The current CBA was signed in a completely different economic reality. Before the media rights boom, before the global attention surge, before the sport crossed into mainstream relevance at a scale few predicted this fast. Now the revenue projections look nothing like they did when that agreement was drafted. Behind closed doors, agents have been running numbers. Players' association leaders have been modeling projections. Investors have been analyzing growth curves. And the conclusion is impossible to ignore. The WNBA is no longer negotiating from a position of scarcity. It's negotiating from leverage. That leverage didn't appear overnight. It built slowly. Sellout after sellout. Primetime slot after primetime slot. Viral highlight after viral highlight. A cultural shift that felt subtle at first but eventually became undeniable. The conversation around the league changed. It stopped being about potential. It became about value. And when value rises, contracts must follow. But here's where it gets complicated. Opting out doesn't automatically guarantee massive raises. It opens the door to tension. It introduces the possibility of a work stoppage. It forces owners to confront costs they may not have planned for. It tests whether growth is sustainable or inflated. It exposes fractures between conservative stakeholders and aggressive expansion thinkers. That's why this moment matters more than a headline. Because if negotiations stall, 2026 suddenly becomes a flashpoint year. If negotiations succeed, the league could experience the single largest economic transformation in women's professional sports history. There is no middle ground here. This is a pivot point. And at the center of it all sits a name that has become synonymous with this era of disruption. Not because she demanded it publicly. Not because she staged a protest. Not because she threatened to leave. But because her presence changed the revenue equation in a way no spreadsheet can ignore. Caitlin Clark's arrival coincided with the most dramatic growth spike the league has seen in decades. Whether people love her, critique her, celebrate her, or question the hype, the data is undeniable. Games featuring her drew unprecedented attention. Road arenas filled. Secondary ticket prices soared. Sponsorship inquiries multiplied. Owners saw it. Sponsors saw it. Players saw it. And when players see proof that the pie has grown, they don't settle for crumbs. This isn't about one athlete. It's about timing. The league was already trending upward. Investment capital was entering. Expansion talks were heating up. But sometimes a catalyst accelerates what was already building. Sometimes one season compresses 5 years of projected growth into 12 months. That compression forces decisions. The commissioner now faces the defining challenge of her tenure. She must balance player demands with ownership concerns. She must convert explosive popularity into sustainable structure. She must avoid a strike without appearing weak. She must convince cautious stakeholders that the growth is real, not a bubble. And she must do it under a spotlight brighter than the league has ever experienced. Because this isn't happening quietly anymore. Fans are paying attention. Media networks are watching. Corporate sponsors are calculating. International markets are evaluating expansion potential. The opt-out isn't just a labor maneuver. It's a declaration that the WNBA believes its current valuation is outdated. The era of gratitude is over. For years, players were expected to feel fortunate simply to have a league. Commercial flights were normalized. Overseas off-seasons were accepted. Salary ceilings were defended as necessary limitations. But when billion-dollar media rights figures enter the conversation, those old explanations start to sound thin. Now the question isn't, can the league afford this? It's, can the league afford not to? Because momentum is fragile. Mishandle this moment and the credibility surge could stall. Nail this negotiation and the WNBA doesn't just grow, it redefines itself permanently. That's why this CBA opt-out feels different. It feels coordinated, timed, strategic. It feels like players understand that leverage is strongest at peak visibility. And peak visibility is exactly where the league stands right now. The next few months will determine whether this was the beginning of dominance or the start of internal conflict. Whether owners embrace the new economics or resist them. Whether collaboration prevails or tension escalates. But one thing is already clear. The axis shifted. The old system has been exposed as outdated. The players have drawn a line. The commissioner has acknowledged the transformation. And the financial blueprint of the league is being redrafted in real time. This isn't a routine contract update. It's the opening move of an economic power struggle that could reshape women's basketball for a generation. And what happens next will decide whether this moment becomes historic or chaotic. The decision wasn't loud. There was no dramatic press conference. No emotional rally. Just a formal notice delivered through the Players Association that changed everything. The WNBA players officially opted out of the current collective bargaining agreement. And inside ownership circles, that move hit like an alarm bell. Because an opt-out isn't symbolic. It's procedural warfare. It activates timelines. It forces renegotiation windows. It introduces the possibility of a strike if new terms aren't reached. It transforms private frustration into public leverage. For years, the existing CBA operated under assumptions that no longer exist. When it was signed, the league was still navigating post-pandemic recovery. Media deals were modest. Attendance projections were cautious. Expansion talk was theoretical. The financial model was built on restraint. But the market moved faster than anyone predicted. Television viewership exploded in key markets. Social engagement numbers tripled in certain stretches. Sponsorship interest surged. Corporate partnerships that once required aggressive pitching began arriving inbound. Even neutral observers started acknowledging what die-hard fans already knew. The product had become appointment viewing. And that's where the old agreement began to feel suffocating. Top rookies were locked into salary structures that looked disconnected from reality. Veterans who carried the league for years saw minimal growth in compensation compared to the revenue spike happening around them. The salary cap ceiling felt artificially low in a moment when valuations were climbing. Players started asking questions. If media rights deals are expanding, if ticket demand is climbing, if sponsorships are multiplying, why are we still negotiating like we're in survival mode? That internal tension didn't explode overnight. It simmered. Locker room conversations turned analytical. Agents began comparing WNBA revenue shares to other leagues. Financial advisors ran projections based on current growth rates versus locked-in compensation. And the math didn't sit well. When the opt-out clause was triggered, it wasn't emotional rebellion. It was a financial calculation. The players understood that leverage is strongest when visibility is highest. They understood that renegotiating from a position of growth is far more powerful than renegotiating during stagnation. Timing is everything in labor negotiations. Opting out now means negotiations must conclude before the next cycle of major media renewals and sponsorship escalations. It forces owners to either align with the new economic reality or risk appearing resistant to progress. And resistance, in this climate, is risky. Because public perception has shifted. Fans are more informed than ever. Social media has amplified every business detail. Salary comparisons circulate instantly. Transparency is no longer optional. Owners know that if negotiations stall, the narrative won't be quiet. It will be framed as players fighting for fairness during a historic growth window. That's not a public relations battle most executives want. But here's the tension behind the scenes. Not all ownership groups are built the same. Large market franchises with deep-pocketed investors see opportunity. Higher salary caps could mean better rosters. Better rosters mean deeper playoff runs. Deeper playoff runs mean more revenue. For them, aggressive expansion aligns with ambition. Smaller market owners view it differently. Tripling payroll commitments is not minor. Upgrading facilities requires capital investment. Permanent charter travel adds millions in operational costs. Increased healthcare commitments stretch long-term budgets. For teams without massive local sponsorship deals, the numbers can feel overwhelming. So when the opt-out became official, the league didn't just enter negotiation mode. It entered internal alignment mode. Because the commissioner now has to bridge that divide. She must convince cautious owners that growth is sustainable. She must demonstrate that investment today prevents stagnation tomorrow. She must show that the data justifies the leap. And the data is persuasive. Some markets reported attendance spikes exceeding 150%. National broadcasts reached viewership figures not seen in decades. Merchandise demand overwhelmed inventory pipelines. Corporate sponsors began treating marquee games like premium assets rather than niche placements. Those aren't anomalies. Those are indicators. The players know it. Which is why the opt-out feels less like a gamble and more like a power assertion. For the first time in years, the players are negotiating from strength rather than necessity. They're not pleading for incremental improvements. They're demanding structural recalibration. And structurally, this changes the tone of every conversation moving forward. Instead of asking, can we afford to raise the cap slightly? The discussion becomes, what is the appropriate percentage of revenue players should receive in a rapidly scaling league? That's a different level of negotiation. It introduces topics that once felt untouchable: aggressive revenue sharing models, luxury tax frameworks, expanded playoff revenue splits, healthcare guarantees extending into retirement. It also introduces risk. If negotiations fail, the possibility of a work stoppage in 2026 becomes real. Players have made it clear privately that they are prepared to sit if necessary. Owners know that losing momentum during a growth surge would be catastrophic. So both sides are staring at the same truth. This moment is fragile. Handled correctly, it becomes the turning point where the WNBA transitions from steady growth to full-scale economic expansion. Mishandled, it becomes a headline about internal conflict overshadowing progress. And that's why the opt-out shocked so many insiders. Because it signaled confidence. Not desperation. Not anger. Confidence. Confidence that the league has crossed into a new tier. Confidence that revenue growth isn't temporary. Confidence that public support will back players if negotiations intensify. And confidence is powerful in labor dynamics. The old model was built on gratitude. The new model is built on valuation. That philosophical shift is what truly unsettled conservative stakeholders. When a workforce begins negotiating based on market value rather than institutional history, the balance of power recalibrates. The players aren't asking to survive anymore. They're asking to scale. And once that mindset takes hold, there's no going back to incrementalism. The opt-out wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration that the old framework expired the moment the league's visibility exploded. Now the question looming over every boardroom isn't whether change is coming. It's how big that change will be. The real panic didn't start with the opt-out notice. It started with a number. $2.2 billion. When the league finalized its landmark media rights agreement, that figure didn't just make headlines. It rewrote the internal financial model of the WNBA overnight. Because media rights aren't symbolic revenue. They're guaranteed money, predictable money, bankable money. And once that deal was signed, the old salary structure stopped making sense. For years, executives justified conservative pay scales by pointing to limited broadcast revenue. Smaller contracts meant smaller profit pools. Smaller profit pools meant tighter caps. It was an argument rooted in math. But when the math changes, the argument collapses. The $2.2 billion figure didn't just signal growth. It signaled institutional validation. Major networks don't commit billions to niche experiments. They invest when they see scalable return, when they see audience stability, when they see demographic expansion. The players understood that immediately. Because media rights revenue doesn't fluctuate with nightly attendance. It doesn't depend on weather or weekday scheduling. It flows in based on contractual obligation. That kind of financial certainty gives leagues freedom to expand payroll without gambling on gate sales alone. Once the ink dried on that deal, agents began recalculating projections. If broadcast revenue increases by that magnitude, if sponsorship inventory multiplies, if global streaming distribution expands, then the salary cap ceiling tied to the previous revenue base is artificially suppressed. And suppression breeds frustration. The disconnect became impossible to ignore. Top rookies were entering the league on contracts that barely cracked six figures. Veterans with championship resumes were earning fractions of what comparable impact players make in other professional leagues. Meanwhile, national broadcasts were pulling viewership spikes that executives once called unrealistic. The visibility was there. The audience was there. The corporate investment was there. But the compensation model lagged behind. That's why the media rights deal became the silent catalyst behind the opt-out decision. It gave the players a concrete anchor in negotiations. Instead of arguing from emotion, they could argue from revenue. And revenue arguments are harder to dismiss. Ownership groups now face a delicate calculation. Yes, the $2.2 billion is transformative. But distribution matters. How much goes to operational infrastructure? How much supports expansion franchises? How much is reserved for long-term investment in facilities, marketing, and youth development? The pie is bigger, but how it's sliced determines everything. Some executives argue for cautious scaling, incremental increases to protect against market correction. Others push for aggressive restructuring, tripling the salary cap to match momentum while public interest is peaking. That internal debate is intense. Because while the media deal represents long-term stability, not all revenue streams have matured equally. Certain markets thrive. Others still operate in rebuilding phases. The commissioner must weigh both realities simultaneously. But here's the undeniable shift. Before this deal, negotiations centered on limitations. After this deal, negotiations center on distribution. That psychological change is massive. Instead of defending why salaries must remain low, owners must now justify why players shouldn't receive a larger percentage of guaranteed income. That flips leverage. It forces transparency. Players have studied revenue sharing models in other leagues. They've analyzed percentage splits. They've examined how growth was reinvested elsewhere. And they're entering these negotiations informed. This isn't a reactive workforce. It's a prepared one. And the data they're citing isn't speculative. Attendance surged in key markets by triple digits. Merchandise demand overwhelmed fulfillment systems. Corporate sponsors began attaching long-term commitments rather than short-term experimental deals. The economic indicators align. The league's valuation trajectory points upward. And valuation drives compensation expectations. That's why insiders describe this moment as the true turning point. The opt-out was procedural. The media deal was foundational. Without that $2.2 billion agreement, owners could argue caution. With it, caution feels defensive. It's also why speculation about salary cap expansion has intensified. Rumors suggest the new framework could more than double current team payroll ceilings within 2 seasons. If that materializes, it would represent the largest financial leap in league history. And that leap wouldn't just impact star players. It would raise the floor. Mid-tier veterans could see life-changing increases. Bench contributors could secure stability without relying on overseas contracts. Rookies could enter the league without immediately calculating off-season relocation for financial survival. That ripple effect matters, because resentment within locker rooms often traces back to imbalance. When revenue explodes but compensation stagnates, tension builds between perception and reality. Raising the salary floor could stabilize that dynamic. It also reframes the narrative around growth. Instead of asking whether the popularity surge is sustainable, the conversation shifts to how quickly infrastructure can scale to meet it. More games, more broadcast windows, more international exhibitions, more digital monetization strategies. The media deal doesn't just support payroll, it supports expansion. And expansion multiplies revenue streams further. This is why conservative ownership resistance feels increasingly isolated. The numbers are too large to ignore. The audience engagement metrics are too strong. The sponsor enthusiasm is too visible. When billions enter the equation, stagnation looks like mismanagement. The commissioner understands this. That's why her tone has subtly evolved. Rather than tempering expectations, she's acknowledged transformation. She's framed negotiations not as crisis control, but as opportunity alignment. That framing matters publicly, because perception shapes sponsorship confidence. And sponsorship confidence fuels future deals. If the league projects unity and ambition during negotiations, corporate partners remain secure. If it projects division and instability, investors hesitate. So the balancing act continues. Players want proportional compensation tied to explosive revenue growth. Owners want sustainable scaling that protects long-term viability. The commissioner must engineer a framework that satisfies both. But here's the quiet reality. Once the $2.2 billion deal became public, the ceiling for acceptable compromise rose dramatically. The players know the money exists. The owners know the players know. And in negotiations, awareness changes everything. The old model relied on limited leverage. The new model is backed by guaranteed revenue. That's why insiders describe this moment as less of a dispute and more of a recalibration. The math changed. And when the math changes, contracts must follow. Here's the uncomfortable truth that hovers over every negotiation room, even if no one says it out loud. The timing of this economic explosion is not random. Yes, the league has been building steadily for years. Yes, expansion plans were already in motion. Yes, investment capital was circling. But there is a difference between steady growth and ignition. Ignition has a face. And that face became unavoidable the moment arenas started selling out on the road. Caitlin Clark's arrival didn't create the Wnba value, but it accelerated its visibility at a speed that forced executives to recalibrate projections in real time. Networks didn't just air games, they promoted them aggressively. Secondary ticket markets didn't just fluctuate, they surged. Merchandise demand didn't just rise, it spiked into scarcity. And that kind of acceleration compresses timelines. When a single player's road appearances generate sellouts in opposing arenas, ownership groups start paying attention differently. Local sponsors lean in harder. Broadcast windows expand. Social media impressions multiply across markets that previously showed minimal engagement. This wasn't theoretical growth. It was measurable. And measurable growth becomes negotiation leverage. Now, here's where the tension creeps in. Veterans carried this league long before ratings spikes and sold-out road tours. They built credibility when coverage was minimal. They endured commercial flights and modest facilities. They played overseas every off-season to stabilize income. So when a rookie enters with unprecedented media gravity, emotions can get complicated. Not because of jealousy, because of timing. When attention floods the league around a new generation, it exposes the imbalance veterans have quietly accepted for years. It highlights how undervalued their contributions were under the old system. And ironically, that spotlight might be the thing that finally corrects it. Because if the salary cap explodes, it doesn't just reward the newest stars. It lifts the entire payroll structure. A veteran who once earned $200,000 annually could realistically see compensation triple under a dramatically expanded cap. That's not symbolic, that's life-altering. Resentment fades when stability rises. This is why the Clark effect conversation is more nuanced than social media debates suggest. It's not about one player receiving all the credit. It's about acknowledging that a cultural surge reached critical mass. And critical mass changes economics. Ownership groups that once debated marketing budgets are now discussing international exhibitions. Networks that once slotted games in low-visibility windows are negotiating premium placement. Corporate sponsors that once hesitated are competing for association. That cascade doesn't happen in a vacuum. Clark's presence amplified it. Her collegiate following transitioned seamlessly into professional viewership. Casual fans became ticket buyers. Neutral observers became repeat viewers. Debates about her impact turned into daily sports media segments. And here's the strategic element that matters most. She didn't publicly demand structural overhaul. She didn't lead press conferences about pay equity. She didn't threaten departures. Instead, her market gravity altered the revenue equation organically. That's more powerful. Because when leverage emerges naturally, it's harder to resist. It's rooted in numbers rather than rhetoric. Sponsors understand this. They follow visibility. They follow engagement metrics. They follow consumer behavior patterns. When those indicators trend upward dramatically around a single era shift, investment strategies adjust. And once sponsors adjust, owners must respond. That's why whispers around the league suggest the new CBA framework reflects not just revenue growth, but revenue acceleration tied to cultural relevance. There's also a psychological component here. When a league becomes headline material across mainstream outlets, internal confidence rises. Players feel the difference. Media treatment shifts. Corporate hospitality budgets expand. Arena operations upgrade presentation quality. The league begins behaving like a major entertainment product rather than a developing property. And that shift reinforces itself. Higher visibility attracts higher investment. Higher investment attracts stronger infrastructure. Stronger infrastructure supports better performance environments. Better performance environments produce better games. It's a feedback loop. Clark didn't build that loop alone. But she accelerated its cycle. That acceleration is what forced negotiations into urgency. Because once growth reaches public consciousness, delaying compensation adjustments looks regressive. Fans see sold-out arenas. They see broadcast partnerships. They see endorsement campaigns. When salaries don't align with that visibility, questions multiply. Owners are aware of that optics challenge. They know that if negotiations stall while revenue headlines continue climbing, public support tilts toward the players quickly. And in a modern sports landscape shaped by social media, perception matters almost as much as balance sheets. There's another layer, too. Clark's individual endorsement portfolio proves something critical. She has secured major brand partnerships independent of league salary. That demonstrates external valuation. It signals that market demand exists beyond institutional structures. And when an athlete's personal brand generates millions while her league contract remains modest, it underscores the structural gap. That gap becomes negotiating fuel. But here's what often gets missed. Clark doesn't personally need the new CBA to become wealthy. Her endorsements already position her financially. What she needs, what every player needs, is a league structure that reflects elite professionalism. Charter travel, top-tier facilities, comprehensive healthcare, revenue alignment. That legitimacy strengthens everyone's long-term brand. Which is why sources close to negotiations suggest she's supportive of aggressive structural reform. Not because it benefits her individually, but because it stabilizes the ecosystem she operates in. And that ecosystem is evolving rapidly. You can see it in expansion chatter. You can see it in global marketing initiatives. You can see it in how draft nights are now treated like premium broadcast events rather than procedural announcements. The league feels different. It carries momentum. And momentum creates urgency. Owners who once questioned whether growth was sustainable now face proof of concept. Ratings data doesn't lie. Ticket scans don't lie. Sponsorship renewals don't lie. The Clark era didn't invent the WNBA's value. It accelerated recognition of it. And recognition is often the final catalyst before structural change. Because once the world acknowledges value, undercompensation becomes visible. And visible imbalance doesn't last long in modern sports economics. That's why the CBA negotiations feel less like a routine update and more like a generational recalibration. The acceleration happened. The revenue followed. Now the structure must catch up. For years, there was one rule that symbolized everything players felt was outdated about the league. It wasn't flashy. It didn't dominate headlines. Casual fans barely understood it. But inside locker rooms, it was explosive. The prioritization rule. On paper, it sounded simple. Players were required to prioritize the WNBA schedule over overseas commitments. If their international season overlapped with WNBA training camp, they faced fines or suspension. The league framed it as a commitment to stability and competitive integrity. But here's what made it controversial. WNBA salaries weren't high enough to replace overseas income. So the rule effectively told players, choose loyalty over financial survival. For many veterans, that choice wasn't theoretical. Overseas contracts in Europe and Asia often paid significantly more than their domestic salaries. Some players earned double, sometimes triple, abroad. That money funded families, supported parents, built savings, created generational stability. The WNBA was their platform. Overseas was their paycheck. When the prioritization rule tightened, tension spiked. Because it felt like being asked to sacrifice income for optics. And the injuries made it worse. Playing year-round without meaningful rest is brutal. 12 months of competition. No true off-season recovery. Constant travel across continents. Limited rehabilitation windows. Soft tissue injuries multiplied. Chronic fatigue became normalized. Careers shortened quietly. Promising trajectories stalled before players reached their prime. All while the league insisted on scheduling control without fully replacing lost income. That's why the new CBA negotiations are targeting this rule directly. Because the entire argument behind prioritization collapses if domestic salaries rise high enough. If players can earn sustainable income without flying halfway across the world every winter, the rule becomes unnecessary. The tension dissolves naturally. The league retains its stars year-round without forcing the issue. That's the strategic shift happening now. Instead of enforcing loyalty, incentivize it. Insiders suggest the proposed CBA framework includes a domestic marketing program designed to pay players during the off-season to promote the league. Appearances. Community engagement. Brand campaigns. International showcases hosted under league contracts. That changes everything. Now, instead of chasing overseas contracts out of necessity, players can remain stateside with structured income. They can rest properly, train intentionally, extend their careers. And career longevity has massive financial implications. Longer careers mean stronger personal brands. Stronger brands mean higher endorsement potential. Higher endorsements attract more sponsors to the league. More sponsors fuel revenue growth. It's another feedback loop. And it starts by eliminating the structural pressure that forced players to leave every winter. There's also a public relations element here. For years, critics pointed to overseas departures as evidence the league couldn't sustain its stars financially. That narrative chipped at legitimacy. Even when unfair, perception lingers. Fixing the prioritization rule silences that criticism. It signals that the WNBA can compensate elite athletes at a level that supports full commitment domestically. But here's the quiet complexity. Overseas leagues won't disappear. European and Asian clubs built their own ecosystems around WNBA talent. They invested heavily. They marketed aggressively. They offered competitive facilities and compensation. Removing American stars from that pipeline affects global dynamics. So negotiations must balance domestic improvement without destabilizing international partnerships. It's delicate. But from the player's perspective, the equation is clear. If revenue is rising, if media rights are secured, if sponsorships are scaling, then off-season financial survival shouldn't require relocation across time zones. That's the philosophical shift behind these talks. From survival to sustainability. There's also a health component that rarely makes headlines. Year-round competition strains the body in ways casual fans don't see. Micro-tears accumulate. Recovery cycles shorten. Mental fatigue compounds physical stress. Social pressure amplifies burnout. A CBA that reduces overseas dependency indirectly protects player health. And healthier players produce better basketball. Better basketball drives ratings. Ratings drive revenue. Revenue supports higher salaries. It's circular. The prioritization rule once symbolized control. Now its potential removal symbolizes trust. Trust that players will commit when compensated fairly. Trust that financial alignment strengthens loyalty more than enforcement ever could. If this rule disappears under the new agreement, it will represent more than policy reform. It will represent philosophical transformation. For years, the league operated as if scarcity required strict boundaries. Now abundance offers flexibility. And flexibility empowers players. That's why this section of the negotiations might quietly become one of the most impactful. Salary cap jumps grab headlines. Billion-dollar deals dominate social media. But structural autonomy, the ability to choose off-season pathways without financial punishment, reshapes daily reality. It reduces friction. It reduces resentment. It aligns incentives naturally. And when incentives align, conflict diminishes. Because at its core, the CBA battle isn't about confrontation. It's about modernization. The prioritization rule belonged to a league fighting for stability. The new framework belongs to a league negotiating from growth. And growth demands evolution. For years, there was one image that quietly undermined everything the league was trying to project. Elite professional athletes. Standing in commercial airport security lines. Waiting at crowded gates. Boarding delayed flights after back-to-back games. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. But it didn't look like a major professional sports league operating at full scale. And players were done pretending it was acceptable. Commercial travel wasn't just inconvenient. It was exhausting. Tight turnarounds after road losses. Delays that cut into recovery windows. Public terminals where security risks weren't hypothetical. They were documented. Harassment incidents surfaced. Unwanted confrontations happened. Cameras followed players through crowded spaces with no buffer. As visibility grew, so did exposure. The same popularity surged driving revenue also increased vulnerability. And that's when charter travel stopped being a luxury request and became a non-negotiable demand. Because the argument shifted. If the league is signing billion-dollar media deals, if sponsors are pouring in, if arenas are selling out, why are athletes still traveling like budget tourists? Owners initially resisted permanent charter commitments for one reason: cost. Charter infrastructure isn't cheap. It requires coordination, scheduling agreements, long-term aviation partnerships, and significant operational expansion. For smaller market franchises, it meant recalculating budgets that were built conservatively. But resistance started looking outdated fast. When high-profile security scares made headlines, public opinion hardened. Fans began asking the same question players were asking. Why is this even a debate? The turning point wasn't a single incident. It was accumulation. Increased attention brought increased scrutiny. Increased scrutiny exposed logistical gaps. And those gaps clashed with the league's new image as a rapidly ascending sports brand. That image matters. Because perception influences sponsorship. Corporate partners don't want to associate with a product that looks under-resourced. They want premium presentation, professionalism, stability, protection of talent. charter flights became symbolic, not just of comfort, of legitimacy. Making charter travel a permanent CBA requirement does more than upgrade seating arrangements. It signals that the league views its athletes as foundational assets worthy of top-tier infrastructure. It shortens travel fatigue cycles. It reduces injury risk linked to tight commercial schedules. It creates private environments where players can decompress without public intrusion. It supports competitive balance by eliminating logistical disadvantages tied to travel delays. And psychologically, it matters. Because when athletes feel protected, they perform differently. Confidence extends beyond the court. Knowing that your league invests in your safety changes how you perceive your value within that system. That's why insiders describe charter travel as one of the clearest dividing lines in negotiations. For players, it's essential. For owners, it's expensive. But here's where the economics circle back. If revenue is scaling, if sponsorships are expanding, if media rights are locked in, infrastructure investment becomes part of long-term growth strategy rather than a short-term expense. The league has already experimented with charter travel during peak scheduling stretches. Feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Recovery improved. Scheduling efficiency increased. Public optics strengthened. So the question evolved. Why revert? And once that question gained traction, resistance softened. Because reverting would signal regression. It would imply that financial caution outweighs athlete welfare at the very moment the league is presenting itself as modernized. That's not a headline ownership groups want. There's also competitive parity to consider. If charter travel becomes standardized, no franchise gains advantage by privately funding superior logistics. The playing field levels. Recovery windows stabilize. Preparation consistency improves. That benefits the product. And the product drives revenue. This is the recurring theme in every section of this negotiation. Investment isn't just expense. It's reinforcement. Reinforcing player health. Reinforcing public perception. Reinforcing corporate confidence. Charter travel is tangible proof of that reinforcement. And here's the deeper layer. As social media attention intensifies, the line between athlete and celebrity blurs. Visibility invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites risk. Private travel reduces exposure during vulnerable moments. It protects not just players, but the league's brand from avoidable incidents. That brand protection carries financial value. Owners understand that. Which is why whispers from negotiation rooms suggest charter travel becoming codified in the new CBA is more likely than ever. If that happens, it will represent more than upgraded flights. It will represent a league stepping fully into major league infrastructure. No more symbolic compromise. No more almost there optics. Just full acknowledgement that the growth era requires growth standards. The commercial airport image belongs to the old model. The charter jet belongs to the new one. And once that transition becomes permanent, it will be one of the clearest signs that the WNBA has crossed from incremental development into institutional confidence. Because leagues that hesitate to invest in logistics usually doubt sustainability. Leagues that invest aggressively signal belief. And belief is exactly what this moment demands. While fans see headlines about rising salaries and charter flights, something much more intense is happening behind closed doors. There's a split. Not loud, not explosive, but very real. On one side, you have the traditional ownership groups, the investors who supported the league when margins were thin and national coverage was scarce. They built their financial models around cautious projections. Slow growth, controlled risk, stability over spectacle. On the other side, you have new money entering the ecosystem. Tech entrepreneurs, venture capital minds, ownership groups with NBA-level ambition. Investors who look at data spikes and see expansion opportunities instead of caution flags. And the tension between those philosophies is shaping this entire CBA battle. Because rapid growth forces a decision. Do you scale aggressively while momentum is peaking? Or do you protect against the possibility that the surge cools? That question is dividing boardrooms. Some owners reportedly worry about what they call a bubble effect. They question whether record attendance and ratings will hold steady 5 years from now. They want gradual increases, measured payroll expansion, guardrails that protect small markets from overextension. Others see hesitation as dangerous. They argue that failing to capitalize on momentum risks flattening it, that aggressive reinvestment fuels sustainability, that modern audiences reward ambition, not caution. And here's where it gets even more complicated. The league's valuation trajectory is no longer theoretical. Franchise valuations have risen sharply. Expansion fees are climbing. Investors aren't entering cautiously, they're entering confidently. That confidence sends a message. External markets believe in the growth curve. So when conservative owners advocate restraint, they risk appearing disconnected from market signals. That's uncomfortable, because no ownership group wants to look like the barrier to progress, especially when the public narrative is leaning heavily toward player empowerment. The strike possibility adds pressure. Players have made it clear that if meaningful reform doesn't materialize, sitting out 2026 is an option. That's not posturing. That's leverage. And a work stoppage during a visibility surge would be catastrophic for momentum. Sponsors could hesitate. Broadcast partners could renegotiate. Casual fans could disengage. Growth curves could flatten. Owners know that, which is why even the cautious factions understand that compromise is inevitable. But compromise doesn't mean agreement on everything. Luxury tax frameworks are reportedly being discussed, a system similar to the NBA's, where high-spending franchises contribute to revenue redistribution. That would allow large market teams to scale payroll aggressively while protecting smaller market sustainability. It's a bridge solution. It satisfies ambition while safeguarding balance. But implementing that structure requires alignment. And alignment requires trust. That's the delicate part. Traditional owners built this league through lean years. They view themselves as stewards. They remember seasons where attendance lagged and profitability was uncertain. Their caution isn't irrational. It's historical. New investors don't carry that emotional memory. They see current metrics. They see sellouts. They see global streaming reach. They see untapped international markets. Their risk tolerance is higher. So the commissioner is navigating more than labor negotiations. She's managing philosophical conflict among stakeholders. If she leans too conservative, players escalate pressure. If she leans too aggressive, cautious owners push back internally. It's a balancing act with generational implications. And here's the strategic reality. Momentum rarely waits for consensus. Leagues that hesitate during growth windows often watch that window narrow. Players understand this. That's why their leverage feels calculated. They're not negotiating during decline. They're negotiating during ascent. And ascent magnifies public sympathy. Because fans can see the difference. They see sold-out arenas. They see ratings headlines. They see endorsement campaigns. If players demand structural reform during that environment, the optics favor them. Owners resisting appear resistant to progress, not protective of stability. That perception influences negotiation psychology. There's also the expansion factor. Cities are lining up for new franchises. Expansion fees inject capital directly into league coffers. That capital can offset rising payroll commitments. Aggressive owners view expansion as a revenue accelerator. Cautious owners view expansion as operational strain. Both are valid, but only one philosophy aligns with rapid cultural momentum. And right now, cultural momentum is the league's greatest asset. That's why whispers of internal friction persist. Not chaos, not crisis, but friction. Debates about pacing. Debates about sustainability. Debates about how far is too far, too fast. The commissioner's public tone suggests she understands the stakes. She's framing the negotiation as transformation, not confrontation. As modernization, not rebellion. That framing helps align owners around shared opportunity rather than perceived threat. But make no mistake, this is a power moment. Because when players opt out during peak visibility, when media rights deals are fresh, when expansion fees are climbing, And when public sentiment leans toward athlete empowerment, ownership leverage narrows. And narrowed leverage forces recalibration. The old guard must decide whether to evolve alongside the league's growth or risk being seen as anchors holding it back. The new money must prove that ambition doesn't equal recklessness. And somewhere in the middle, the future of the WNBA's economic structure is being drafted. This isn't just about salary caps. It's about philosophy. Are you building cautiously for survival? Or are you building boldly for dominance? The next agreement will answer that question permanently. Here's the part that hasn't been shouted from podiums yet, but it's sitting at the center of these negotiations. Revenue sharing. Not token bonuses. Not appearance stipends. Not incremental bumps. Real percentage-based revenue participation. For years, the WNBA operated under a relatively conservative revenue split model. Players received a defined share, but the overall pie was small. That meant even fair percentages translated into modest paydays. The structure wasn't necessarily unjust, it was limited by scale. But when the scale changes, the split becomes the real battleground. Because once media rights surge into the billions, once merchandise sales spike across markets, once ticket demand outpaces supply, the percentage becomes more important than the base salary. Insiders suggest the new CBA could aggressively revisit the revenue-sharing formula. Instead of capping player earnings under a rigid structure, there's discussion about tying compensation directly to measurable revenue growth. That's transformative, because it aligns incentives. If the league grows, players grow with it. If sponsorship revenue increases, player income scales proportionally. If jersey sales skyrocket, athletes directly benefit. That model turns players into true stakeholders. And stakeholders behave differently than employees. When athletes see direct correlation between engagement and compensation, marketing shifts organically. Social media activity becomes strategic. Community appearances carry long-term value. Personal brands amplify league brands. It becomes symbiotic. The rumored restructuring would also address something veterans have quietly pushed for: long-term security. Lifetime healthcare provisions for retired players have surfaced in negotiations. That's not glamorous. It won't dominate highlight reels. But it matters deeply to those who paved the way during leaner eras. For decades, former players exited the league with limited post-career support. Injuries lingered. Medical bills accumulated. Institutional recognition felt symbolic rather than structural. A new healthcare commitment would signal that the league values legacy, not just current profitability. And that builds trust. Trust between generations. Trust between players and ownership. Trust between past sacrifice and present prosperity. Mental health funding is reportedly another focus area. The visibility surge hasn't just amplified revenue, it's amplified scrutiny. Social media pressure intensifies daily. Public debate can turn toxic quickly. The psychological toll of modern sports fame is real. Allocating dedicated wellness funding isn't cosmetic. It's preventative. Because sustained growth requires sustainable athletes. There's also the expansion whisper that refuses to fade. A player-owned expansion franchise. It sounds radical, almost unrealistic. But the fact that it's being discussed at all signals a mindset shift. If players secure stronger revenue positioning, collective investment in ownership becomes conceivable. Imagine a union-backed franchise where athletes hold equity. That would alter power dynamics permanently. It would blur the line between labor and ownership. It would introduce a precedent that reverberates across professional sports. The commissioner hasn't endorsed the idea publicly, but she hasn't fully dismissed innovative ownership structures either. That ambiguity keeps the conversation alive. And even the possibility influences negotiation posture. Because once ownership becomes part of the long-term conversation, players stop thinking short-term. They start thinking generationally. Global expansion is another piece of the puzzle. London exhibitions. Mexico City showcases. International partnerships leveraging rising global interest. When players become ambassadors beyond domestic markets, revenue multiplies. And if revenue multiplies, percentage-based models become even more powerful. This is where the entire negotiation evolves beyond salary figures. It becomes about structural equity. For years, the WNBA operated like a growing startup. Careful investment, limited margins, controlled ambition. Now it's negotiating like a scaling enterprise. Scaling enterprises reward contributors proportionally. That's the philosophical pivot happening. But here's the quiet tension. Revenue sharing demands transparency. Owners must disclose financial details clearly. Players must trust reported figures. Governance structures must tighten. Transparency strengthens fairness, but it also exposes inefficiencies. Some franchises may be operating more profitably than others. Some may be benefiting disproportionately from visibility surges. When percentages enter negotiations, those disparities surface. And that can get uncomfortable. Still, discomfort often precedes evolution. The rumored scrapping of the conservative revenue model in favor of a more aggressive structure isn't reckless. It's responsive. Responsive to media deals. Responsive to ticket demand. Responsive to cultural relevance. Responsive to generational talent entering the league at a moment of explosive visibility. Because here's the reality. If players are driving unprecedented engagement, they won't settle for fixed ceilings disconnected from growth. They want alignment. Alignment between effort and compensation. Alignment between risk and reward. Alignment between visibility and valuation. If the new CBA locks that alignment in, it won't just boost salaries. It will redefine the league's identity. From employer-employee dynamic to collaborative enterprise. And that shift may end up being the most significant transformation of all. Because once players feel like partners rather than participants, the league stops negotiating from fear. It starts operating from confidence. And confidence, in sports economics, compounds quickly. Here's the part most people are still underestimating. This isn't just a contract renegotiation. It's an identity shift. For nearly 3 decades, the WNBA carried a certain narrative, resilient, growing, respected, but always framed with qualifiers. Emerging, developing, building. Even during its best seasons, there was an undertone of proving legitimacy. That undertone is fading. And this CBA moment is the line between those two eras. Because once you secure billion-dollar media commitments, once arenas are consistently full, once expansion franchises become competitive assets, once sponsors treat the league like premium inventory, you're no longer asking for validation. You're managing power. That's the quiet transformation happening. Yes, Caitlin Clark's name surfaces constantly in these discussions. Yes, her presence accelerated visibility. Yes, her impact forced conversations about valuation. But this new era isn't built around one athlete. It's built around structure. Structure determines sustainability. The commissioner understands this better than anyone. Her legacy won't be measured by press conferences. It will be measured by the agreement that emerges from this negotiation window. If she secures a balanced but aggressive framework, she becomes the architect of a new economic foundation. If she miscalculates, she risks slowing the most explosive growth period in league history. That pressure is real. Because 2026 isn't just another season. It's the leverage year. If negotiations stall, a work stoppage becomes plausible. And a work stoppage during peak cultural momentum would be devastating. Not permanently fatal, but damaging enough to interrupt the trajectory. Sponsors dislike uncertainty. Networks dislike scheduling instability. Fans dislike labor disputes. So both sides know the stakes. That's why this moment feels intense without being chaotic. It's high-stakes chess. The players are unified in one key belief. The old system undervalued them. Not symbolically. Structurally. They see the revenue. They see the expansion fees. They see the valuation shifts. They see the investment capital flowing in. And they want the framework to reflect it. The owners are unified in one key concern: sustainability. Growth must be real. Expansion must be supported. Smaller markets must survive. Infrastructure must scale responsibly. Both positions contain truth. But momentum usually sides with the bold. Because modern sports economics rewards leagues that invest during growth windows, not those that hesitate. The phrase, era of survival, doesn't fit anymore. This isn't a league fighting for relevance. It's a league negotiating from relevance. And relevance compounds. Higher salaries attract deeper talent pools. Deeper talent improves competition. Stronger competition drives viewership. Viewership drives revenue. Revenue drives expansion. Expansion strengthens bargaining power. The cycle reinforces itself. That's why this isn't about winning one negotiation. It's about locking in a trajectory. Once the new CBA is signed, assuming it reflects aggressive modernization, it becomes the blueprint for the next decade. Future players will enter a league structured for growth rather than containment. And that psychological difference matters. When rookies arrive expecting professionalism rather than compromise, standards shift. Training facilities improve. Medical support expands. Marketing budgets rise. Presentation quality elevates. The league stops chasing perception. It defines it. And here's the final layer. This transformation didn't happen quietly. The entire sports world is watching. Other leagues are watching. Corporate America is watching. Investors are watching. Because if the WNBA successfully converts cultural momentum into structural reform, it becomes a case study. A model for how women's professional sports scale when investment aligns with audience demand. That's bigger than one salary cap. Bigger than one media deal. Bigger than one superstar. It's about proving that when women's sports receive comparable financial commitment, the return is not hypothetical. It's measurable. And measurable success silences doubt. So as negotiations continue, the real question isn't whether salaries will rise. They will. The real question is how aggressively the league commits to its own evolution. Does it inch forward? Or does it leap? Because the axis already shifted. The players exercised leverage. The commissioner acknowledged transformation. The revenue proved legitimacy. Now the framework must catch up. And when it does, the league won't just look different on paper. It will feel different in identity. The era of gratitude is over. The era of valuation has begun. We're standing at the hinge point of a new chapter. The opt-out wasn't rebellion. It was strategy. The media deal wasn't hype. It was proof. The charter debate wasn't comfort. It was legitimacy. The revenue split discussions aren't greed. They're alignment. And when alignment meets momentum, transformation follows. The next agreement will determine whether 2026 becomes a celebration of evolution or a flashpoint of resistance. But one thing is undeniable. The league is no longer negotiating from scarcity. It's negotiating from strength. And that changes everything. If you've been following this story closely, you already understand how rare moments like this are. Structural change in professional sports doesn't happen often. When it does, it reshapes decades. So if you want deeper breakdowns like this, not surface headlines, but the real power dynamics underneath, this is exactly what we cover here. The channel is still growing, and the subscriber count is low right now. But that means you're early. If you found value in this analysis, take 2 seconds to subscribe. It directly supports long-form deep dives like this. Hit the like button so the algorithm knows this conversation matters. And drop a comment with your take. Should the league go aggressive with revenue sharing or protect stability first? Because the next era of the WNBA isn't coming quietly. And the people paying attention now will understand it before everyone else does.